Similar yet profoundly different. Primarily because in New Zealand republicanism is much less significant than it is in Australia. Any appraisal of the position of the monarchy in New Zealand inevitably invites comparison with Australia and to a lesser extent Canada and the United Kingdom. We share many common attributes, though it is important to be mindful of the differences. In common are our constitutional origins and underlying principles, both originally from the United Kingdom. We share a common crown. This is not simply the same Queen, but the same principle or concept, the same perception of what the monarchy is. In all three countries, we entrust the day-to-day government to a political executive, to politicians responsible to Parliament, and ultimately to the electorate. We share the same concept of the separation of powers, where no single branch or organ of government is entrusted with more power or responsibility than it can reasonably be expected to exercise. These are but very few of the enormous range of similarities between our countries. But to look at the differences, two stand out. The first is that both Canada and Australia are federations, and New Zealand is a unitary state. Very much a unitary state, to the extent that recently a politician suggested that we abolish local and regional government and simply have one government for the entire country. Completely impractical suggestion, but the fact that a senior politician made that suggestion is quite remarkable. But also, we lack an entrenched constitution. That might seem remarkable to someone from a federation where, of necessity, you must have an entrenched constitution to assign the powers and responsibilities between the respective organs of government, regional, federal, local, provincial, whatever they're called. But this is not to say that New Zealand does not have a constitution, simply that there is no formal document which can be said to be the source of constitutional power in New Zealand. As a consequence of this, there is no formal limitation upon the powers of Parliament, upon the supremacy or sovereignty of Parliament. And therefore, it is theoretically possible for New Zealand to become a republic overnight, or for any constitutional reform to be implemented extremely quickly. We never acquired a written constitution, an entrenched constitution, simply because it wasn't needed. Unlike both Canada and Australia, where the process of federation required such a document. To move specifically to the position of the monarchy in New Zealand. In common with other countries established predominantly or largely by settlers from the British Isles, excepting only the United States of America, we in New Zealand have a constitutional monarchy, constitutional or limited monarchy. In 1840, when New Zealand became a colony of the United Kingdom, the monarchy or the crown meant the British monarchy. It was the Queen of the United Kingdom, unfortunately described in the text as Queen of England, who concluded the Treaty of Waitangi with the indigenous Maori population. With the growth of a newly settled colony, the British government progressively entrusted more power and responsibilities to the colonial executive and Parliament. This process was accelerated in the early part of the 20th century when New Zealand, together with several other long-standing British colonies, notably Canada and Australia, was granted the status of a dominion. But if anyone were to ask me what was the date of independence for New Zealand, I would put up my hands and say, I have no idea. The Dominions shared a common allegiance to the Crown. But since the 1930s in particular, this has meant something quite different in New Zealand to what it does in Canada or Australia. And I would lay this primarily, I would say this is primarily due to the treaty relationship between the indigenous Maori population and the government. To briefly describe the nature of the Treaty of Waitangi, in Canada you are familiar with a range of treaties with the native populations. In New Zealand there was only one treaty, a common text signed by several hundred chiefs from across the country. Not every chief signed. Not every part of the country was covered. But it was very early deemed in law to cover the entire country. Though if we were to ask the question of a court, what is the legal basis of sovereignty, and that's not a question that the average politician would wish to ask, the answer is that New Zealand was deemed to be a settled colony. But I won't go into that conundrum. The practical reality is that the legitimacy of government in New Zealand depends not solely on regular elections, as in any democratic regime, but also on a partnership based on a 170-year-old treaty between the Crown, specifically Queen Victoria, and now her successor, Elizabeth II, and the Maori population. And that has meant that in discourse, political discourse in New Zealand, there is much talk of the Crown, and when the expression is used, it's usually used in the context of the permanent government, as distinct from the government of the day. This evolution of a distinct New Zealand Crown went hand in hand with the nationalising of the office of Governor-General. In the early part of the 20th century, the Governor-General was seen as the local agent of the British government. Despite being granted a measure of personal discretion, successive appointees were expected to refer contentious matters to British ministers or senior Whitehall officials. This link began to attenuate in the 1920s. But the essentially British nature of the institution of Governor-General persisted for as long as appointments were limited to those who were not only born but also domiciled in Britain. As well as representing the Crown, the office of Governor-General in New Zealand had come to represent, to some extent, the values and attitudes of a particular slice of British society transported to New Zealand, namely the aristocracy. The first New Zealand-born Governor-General, Sir Arthur Porritt, was appointed in 1967. And while this did not produce any significant immediate change to the functions of the office, it did mark the beginning of a transition in the character and style of the office. Sir Dennis Blundell became the first New Zealand-born Governor-General who was also a New Zealand resident. appointed as recently as 1972. Because neither Porritt nor Blundell were members of the British aristocracy, there was no expectation among New Zealanders that they would conduct themselves as such. While they represented the Queen, they did not, in any sense, represent Britain. This led to some uncertainty as to exactly what the role of the Governor-General was. Every appointee since the 1970s has been a New Zealander, appointed formally since 1941 and informally since 1910 by the Sovereign on the advice of New Zealand ministers. More recent appointees, including the first Maori Governor-General, also the first and only Bishop to hold office, Sir Paul Reeves, in 1985, the first woman, Dame Catherine Tizard, in 1990, were notable for the first time putting a distinct New Zealand stamp on the office of Governor-General. It was probably helped by the fact that both have reasonably strong personalities. We were set back a little by the next two appointments, Sir Michael Hardy-Boys, 1996, and Dame Sylvia Cartwright, 2001, both senior judges. Appointed primarily because at that time constitutional reform had seen the abandonment of the first-past-the-post voting system in favour of mixed member proportional representation. The effect of that was that the powers that be in Wellington felt it was necessary to have someone with some constitutional ability holding office. The problem is, and it's almost reversed the situation that we heard from Peter Boyce in Australia, was that though the Governor-General may have handled a political or constitutional crisis very well, they weren't necessarily suitable for the community, social and ceremonial functions of the office. So a compromise was required and we didn't quite match that. The current Governor-General, Sir Anand Satyanand, not only the first Indian, but also, he's the first Indian Governor-General, who's also on appointment, the first who did not have a knighthood. That has now been corrected. He was a relatively junior judge, so he had the legal background, but he had, after being a judge, been the Ombudsman, and he was known as a staunch member of society who was not just a judge. So he's able to deal with the ceremonial and social aspects of the office. And I think he could handle constitutional crises quite well.